Hello, everyone, and welcome to this webinar on young people on the European Union labor market. My name is Antti Sykkö.
And my name is Nevena Cholakova, and together with Antti, we work at Eurostat on labor market statistics.
Okay, so the first question regarding the labor market statistics is naturally that how do we measure the labor market? So these statistics by Eurostat are based on the European Union Labor Force Survey, which is the largest household survey in Europe. It covers all European Union countries, as well as some EFTA and candidate countries. It uses harmonized methods, so the results are comparable across countries and over time. It's a continuous quarterly survey with more than 1.7 million interviews carried out in each quarter. So, what do we measure then? Well, on the right hand side, you see an illustration of a population, and this highlights that we count people, not jobs. And the main idea is to divide people into three groups: employed, unemployed, and those outside the labor force. And the main objective is then to provide descriptive statistics on each of these groups. So these are the cornerstone concept for labor market statistics. In this webinar, we focus on young people aged 15 to 29 in the European Union. So this is the population we're looking at. And we can now start classifying them into these three groups. We're starting with those who are employed, meaning that they have a job from where they got pay or profit. And they were roughly half of the youth population in European Union last year. In addition to the employed people, some are unemployed. This means that they were actively seeking and were available for work. Last year, they were about 7% of the youth population in the European Union. The remaining people are outside the labor force, meaning they are not working or actively seeking for work, and they were roughly 44% of the youth population. And one can think now that if the remaining people are outside the labor force, then employed and unemployed form the labor force, which is the basis for many labor market statistics. Next, I would like to show two of the most commonly known and used indicators in this domain. We start with employment rate. This is calculated by dividing the number of employed people by the total population. So it shows the share of employed in the population. And this chart shows the development of employment rate of young people in the European Union from 2011 to 2025. So we can see that after an initial decline following the financial crisis, employment increases steadily until 2019. Then in 2020, there's a clear drop due to the pandemic, followed by a strong recovery to a new record levels. And overall, while there's a small decrease in 2025, the trend can be seen as positive. Second, the unemployment rate. And this is calculated by dividing the number of unemployed people by the labor force. And this is important. So, unlike the employment rate, it does not use the total population. Instead, unemployment rate shows the share of unemployed people within the labor force. And over here is a similar chart showing the development of unemployment rate in the European Union for the last 15 years. We see that unemployment peaks around 2013 and then declines steadily until 2019. There's a temporary increase in 2020, followed by a return to a downward trend. And overall, despite a slight increase in 2025, the trend can be seen as positive. And we've now covered the basics of labor market statistics together with two main indicators. And next, I would like to hand over the floor to my colleague Nevena, who will introduce more detailed statistics in this domain.
Thank you, Antti, for the thorough introduction to the topic. I want to continue directly with another unemployment indicator, but this time the monthly youth unemployment rate for the EU, where, as an exception to the other charts, we are showing the young people under 25 only. So overall, you see the same evolution of the time series as what Antti just showed you with the annual data, But here you see it with more granularity. For example, again, the increase in 2013 and then the steady decrease. But most importantly, what I would like to highlight here is the reactivity of the monthly data series. So immediately you see the peak in early 2020 with the onset of the coronavirus crisis, which then plateaus a little bit before decreasing again. Once again, here I would like to highlight the granularity and the reactivity of this monthly youth unemployment indicator. And while unemployment and employment are main indicators, I would like to continue by presenting some additional measures which can give you a more complete picture of young people on the EU labor market. To begin with, I'd like to talk about the unemployment ratio. It's an alternative to the unemployment rate, which Andy just presented. And as you remember, that is the percentage of unemployed people to the labor force. Here, instead, we talk about the percentage of unemployed young people to the total youth population, which can include more people who do not necessarily fall into the youth labor force, such as students, for example. Here in the graph, you can see the youth unemployment rate and ratio for 2025 per country. You see that in some countries, the rate and ratio of youth unemployment are closer together than in others. For example, if you take a look at the Netherlands, you see that it is the country where the closest together, which indicates that in that country, the youth labor force is quite close to the total youth population. You also see a lot of variation between the EU countries. For example, if you look at the highest rates, which are in Spain and Sweden, but then when you look at the ratio in Sweden is actually higher than the one in Spain, again indicating that in that country, the youth labor force is closer to the total youth population. Then I'd like to continue by presenting the youth labor market slack and introducing the concept of the extended labor force. As we have seen already, the classic labor force includes only the employed and the unemployed, and they have very specific definitions, but there can be other people who only partially fulfill those definitions. This is why in the extended labor force, we also consider those who are underemployed part-time workers who would like to work more hours, people who are seeking a job but are not immediately available to start one, or people who are available but not seeking a job at the moment. The labor market slack, therefore, shows the percentage of the unemployed and those new categories as a percentage of the total extended labor force. And more broadly, it can be interpreted as showing the people in the extended labor force who have an unmet supply of employment. Here in the graph, you see the youth labor market slack from 2023 to 2025 on a quarterly basis for the EU specifically. As you can see, it's relatively stable during this period, and in all quarters, the unemployed people form the largest component of the slack. The second largest group are those who are available to work but not seeking a job at the moment, who can be said to be the disencouraged ones on the labor market, and also the underemployed part-time workers. Over all the quarters, you also see that the smallest group are those who are seeking work but not immediately available to start a job. Once again, this is the situation at the EU level, but if you look at the data on the country level, it's possible that there can be some variation to this. Finally, I'd like to talk about a very youth-specific indicator, which is the so-called NEET rate. It stands for those who are neither in employment nor in education or training, and it's calculated as the percentage of those young people to the total youth population. Here in the graph, you see the NEET rates by country for 2025, which is our latest available data. You see the EU average of 11%, and then quite a lot of variation between the different countries. For example, Romania has the highest NEET rate of close to 20%, followed by Bulgaria and Greece, while the lowest rates for 2025 were recorded in the Netherlands and Sweden. Here I can give some context that the EU policy goal is to lower the NEET rate for the EU to 9% by 2030, which some countries have already achieved already. So with this, I would like to conclude the presentation part of this webinar and we can turn to responding to questions from users. Thank you.
Previously, we classified the whole youth population into these three groups, but we can do the same for the students. So students can be, in fact, in any of these groups. And last year, we see that 25% of the students were employed, 3% were unemployed, and 72% were outside the labor force. This can be shown in this chart that shows the labor market status of young people in formal education across the European Union countries. And as you can see, there are clear differences across countries. For example, in the Netherlands and Denmark, a large share of students are employed, and this means that many combine studies with work. Then, in contrast, in European Union countries on the right-hand side of the chart, starting from Hungary, the share of students in labor force is much lower, generally below 10%. Then looking at unemployment, some Nordic countries, especially Finland and Sweden, show notable shares of unemployed students. And this basically just means that these people are looking and are available to start work alongside their studies. And finally, in almost all European Union countries, the majority of students are outside the labor force. However, some of these students may still be searching for a job, but are not yet available to start it. And in this case, they are counted in further subgroups. Now, with this in mind, I will now hand over to my colleague Nevena, who will take a closer look at these groups.
Indeed, thank you, Antti. Uh, Students outside the labor force might be part of the extended labor force, if you remember the part of the presentation on labor market Slack. Going back to the graph I showed you earlier, some of those students in the out of the narrow labor force might find themselves, for example, belonging to one of the categories you see here. For example, available to start working but not searching because they're students. In this case, they would be counted as part of the labor market slack in our statistics. And once again, this indicates those young persons are experiencing the need for employment and are still moving closer from out of the labor market to the labor market. So Eurostat does not really make predictions for the future of the labor market, but what we can say is that from 2011 to 2025, the period which we talked about in the presentation, the trend for youth employment has been positive. Overall, youth employment has increased and youth unemployment has decreased for this period. And we have more young people moving into the labor market.
Last year, in 2025, the total number of employed people aged 15 and over in the European Union was about 209 million. Then of these, approximately 13 million were non-European Union citizens. And out of these 13 million, 2.7 million were young people, meaning that young people account for about 21% of all employed non-European Union citizens. Then among young people aged 15 to 29, there were in total about 35.7 million employed persons, including those 2.7 million non-European Union citizens. And they represent roughly 7.5% of employment in this young age group. So overall, these figures show that millions of non-nationals are active in the European Union labor market and that young people form an important part of this group.
In our data collection, we do have figures on employment by educational attainment, which you can find in the Eurostat database or in our articles. So overall, they show quite clearly that the employment rate of people with a tertiary education, meaning a bachelor's degree, master's, or a PhD, is higher than the employment rate of people who have only a medium or a low education. So indeed, educational attainment matters for employment, and those with tertiary education have the highest employment rates of all. Thank you for watching the webinar today, and thank you for the many interesting questions. For those we didn't manage to answer right now, we will make sure to answer them in writing later.
Thank you for watching and see you at next Eurostat webinar. Have a good day all and thank you.